My name is Kamala Carmen. I am the parent organizing liaison for the New York Consortium schools and the mother of two Consortium school graduates. This is session 3 of a 4-part Zoom series we're calling Where Thinking Thrives. That is also the title of our latest report, which you can read or download from our website, which is performanceassessment.org, and that link will be in the chat. In this session, we will be exploring why our schools have built an alternative to standardized testing and why we want to ensure that our teachers have the ability to create their own curriculum. Of course, standardized testing and mandated curriculum affect not just the adults, teens, and tweens attending consortium schools. I invite you to think of this discussion grounded in our schools as a prism through which the wider and thorny issue of standardization in education can be examined. I'll start this evening by giving you a brief introduction to the consortium. After that, we'll hear from our guest presenter, Stan Karp of Rethinking Schools. Stan will fill us in on the history of standardization in U.S. schools, bringing us right into the present. We'll follow with a panel discussion that features a consortium principal and teachers reacting to the presentation, including letting us know how our schools have carved another path. And I'll wrap up by filling you in on how you personally can push back against standardized testing and curriculum, whether you have a third grader or a ninth grader. There will also be opportunities for you to pose questions to the panelists or to me. And to that end, as questions come up for you, please type them in the chat, which my colleague AJ Rathman Noonan will be monitoring. We will choose as many of your questions as we have time for. One word for those of you who attended earlier sessions of this series. Although the intro to the consortium I'm about to give you will sound very familiar, please don't stray far. It is only a few minutes, and we don't want you to miss Stan's presentation, upon which the rest of this session depends. The consortium is actually shorthand for the New York Performance Standards Consortium. We are a network of public schools connected by shared core values and some common practices. Chief among these practices is a commitment to inquiry-based education. As opposed to the type of education most of us here probably experienced, and which is still the norm in many schools today, students in an inquiry-based classroom are not expected to passively absorb information from their teacher or the textbook. Instead, they actively explore, research, and investigate their way into solving problems or questions that they have a genuine interest in, questions that emerge organically from the context of their classrooms and their communities. Spoiler alert, that sort of organic process is incompatible with the use of standardized curriculum that has been written and developed for a generic national market. They communicate the results of their inquiry through discussion and writing and engage in reflection and revision throughout. This kind of learning tends to go deep rather than broad, and so is ill-suited to assessment methods like standardized tests that are merely checking to see if the range of material was covered. For this reason, the consortium has developed an alternative way for our students to demonstrate or perform their learning, the PBAT, or Performance-Based Assessment Task. For over 25 years, the New York State Education Department has supported our schools' use of PBATs by granting our students a waiver from most Regents exams. While most public high school students in New York State must take and pass 5 Regents exams in order to graduate, consortium students take only the English Language Arts Regents. When schools aren't driven by standardized tests, they're freed up to place the development of students' minds and ideas at the center of what they do. This is the engine that motors the consortium. In order to graduate, all students in our schools must complete PBATs in 4 subject areas: math, science or engineering, literature, and social studies. Some schools may add other subjects like foreign language. Each PBAT has a written component, typically an analytical paper or a lab report. Students also do an oral defense where they answer questions on demand about their work. Both the written and oral PBAT are assessed by outside evaluators. That is, the student's own teacher in that discipline is not the only one evaluating their work. Throughout, students develop and express their own ideas and thinking. I noted earlier that the consortium is a network of schools. What's the purpose for that, and why does that matter? Being joined in a network provides support for the people working in our schools and keeps them accountable to our shared values and goals. Each of our schools is distinct. They're not centrally controlled. Instead, the network provides, as we like to say, top-down support for bottom-up innovation. This includes cross-network teacher exchanges and professional learning groups, shared development of the rubrics used to score the PBATs, and research about the effectiveness of our work. Here's a look at some consortium stats. The consortium is 38 schools, 36 of which are in New York City, in 4 out of the 5 boroughs. The other 2 are in Rochester and Ithaca. The group of schools is very diverse. 7 of our schools are transfer schools that serve students who typically have not had success in their previous schools. 5 are international schools, which serve newly arrived immigrant students. And 6 are 6 through 12 schools, meaning they have middle school grades in addition to the high school grades that all other consortium schools have. The majority of our schools are unscreened. The graphs on the right compare consortium schools in green to other New York City schools in orange. As you can see, consortium schools as a group actually serve a higher needs student population than New York City public schools as a whole. This slide shows something remarkable. Our students are outperforming their peers when it comes to four-year graduation rates. The difference for students with disabilities, as you can see in that second to bottom bar graph on the left, is particularly noteworthy. And that good news continues beyond graduation. Consortium schools outperform the city and the country on college enrollment and persistence, meaning staying enrolled in college. I'll end this intro with this slide, which is a quote from researchers who analyze data about the consortium graduates who attend CUNY colleges. They conclude that the tendency of consortium students to outperform their demographically similar peers is especially pronounced for Black males, writing that, quote, they are noticeably more likely to persist in college and to receive higher degrees, unquote. So, when this call began, I suggested that you write in the chat something you knew about standardized testing or curriculum. Here are a few things people wrote. Standardized curriculum has come in cycles, some big expectation to follow with fidelity, then an acknowledgement that differentiation is necessary to help it reach more learners, to a shift towards individualization until it swings back again. And here's another one. I do not believe that standardized testing shows the true intelligence of students. Further, I don't believe studying for these tests promotes retention of the information. And now to paint the bigger picture of standardization in education, I have the honor of introducing you to our guest presenter for tonight, Stan Karp. Stan taught English and journalism to high school students in Paterson, New Jersey for 30 years. He recently retired from New Jersey's Education Law Center, where he was director of the Secondary Reform Project. He is also an editor of the school reform journal, Rethinking Schools, and has co-edited several books, including Rethinking Our Classrooms, Teaching for Equity and Justice, and Rethinking School Reform, Views from the Classroom. And I'll hand it over to Stan.
Thanks. Good to be with you today. Today I was asked to share a brief overview of the history of standardized testing and the policy framework that's built upon it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of this history, and hopefully you're sharing it with your students, your parents, and your colleagues, because tracing the history of standardized testing is actually one useful way to understand where all these tests came from and to push back against their misuse and overuse. The origins of standardized testing trace back to racialized theories of intelligence and attempts to measure it. In the early 1900s, Lewis Terman, who was a Stanford professor and someone who believed in eugenics, helped develop the first IQ test and also the Army Alpha test, which was used to sort and label recruits during the massive mobilization of the Army for World War I. These tests literally helped decide who went to officer school and who went to the trenches. After World War I, excuse me, the use of standardized testing in schools increased dramatically. In the 1920s, Carl Brigham from Princeton University famously developed the SAT test to identify what at the time he called defective strains in the population. The arrival of large numbers of immigrant students in big city high schools also fed tracking and ability grouping, which was facilitated by the greater use of standardized testing. These early tests were really not so much about assessing learning or intelligence, whatever that might mean, as they were about disguising race and class privilege as merit. They were straight up tools of white supremacy, and in many ways, they still are. More recently, standardized testing became the foundation of a particular kind of education reform, often described as test and punish, for the way the results of these exams have been used. Here are some landmarks in the history of test and punish school reform. In 1983, A Nation at Risk was issued under the Reagan administration, and this was a federal report that gave rise to the movement for standardized state curriculum, which in turn fed the growth of standardized testing. The National Assessment of Educational Proficiency, called NAEP sometimes, is often called the nation's report card, and it's the longest running set of test performance by US students. In 1980, NAEP's proficiency levels, the passing scores, were deliberately set unrealistically high, so high that no real schools have ever met them. Even in the best performing states on the NAEP, which are typically Massachusetts and New Jersey, half the kids fail to score proficient. The cut scores or passing scores on the standardized test can produce any result that the test designers desire. And while NAEP does have some useful features, its proficiency levels were designed to produce a narrative of failure. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed with bipartisan support. NCLB dramatically changed the focus of federal education policy, moving it away from its historic role in promoting access and equity through support for things like school integration or extra funding for high poverty schools or services for students with special needs to a version of test and punish. NCLB used test scores and test score gaps to label schools as failures without providing the strategies and resources needed to close the gaps. The race to the top doubled down on NCLB and promoted teacher-based, test-based teacher evaluation. It also used test scores to close schools, primarily in Black and brown communities, and to expand charter privatization. Between 2009 and 2012, over 4,000 public schools were closed, while the number of charter schools doubled. And Common Core came along also in 2009, pouring hundreds of millions of public dollars into two new testing consortia, one called PARC, the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, and one called Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. These new Common Core tests were based on the premise that because millions of students were not passing existing tests, the solution was to give harder ones. And this was another wrong answer. NCLB required annual testing in grades 3 through 8 and high school, in place of grade span testing, which used to test kids once in elementary school, once in the middle grade years, and once in high school. Before NCLB, only 19 states tested students every year in language arts and math. After NCLB, all 50 did. Every student, every grade, every year. By 2015, the average urban student was taking 112 tests between pre-K and the end of 12th grade. 16 states had test-based promotion policies, 27 states had testing for high school diplomas, and 43 used test-based teacher evaluation. The effects of this massive misuse and overuse of standardized testing were predictable, and they were also known in advance to social scientists. Both activists and researchers became familiar with a maxim developed by the social scientist Donald Campbell in 1976 that became known as Campbell's Law. This is Campbell's Law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. This obsession with quantifying learning played out again during the idea of measuring learning loss during the pandemic, even though measuring gaps in opportunity and resources that are reflected in the test scores has never translated into the kind of equitable and adequate school funding needed to address the inequality that exists all around us. For example, testing kids for learning loss in the middle of the pandemic was like passing out thermometers in the middle of a malaria outbreak. Thermometers are not healthcare, and testing is not education. So this is what we've gotten from decades of standardized testing: a narrative of public education failure. Decision-making about education policy moved away from schools and educators to distant bureaucracies and politicians. Narrowed curriculum, degraded instruction and scripted curriculum. Expansion of the school-to-prison pipeline. One study showed that rigorous high school testing, for example, increased incarceration rates by as much as 12%. We've had periodic waves of cheating scandals. In the decade after NCLB was passed, nearly 200 schools, districts in a dozen states saw cheating scandals. Fair Test identified 65 different ways that schools cheated to boost test scores, from cooking the testing pool to falsifying answer sheets. The good news, the wrong direction. I think that's what we want. The good news is that these policies created a massive grassroots opposition movement that was led by parents, students, and educators. And this resistance and activism actually produced some real victories. The opt-out movement was led by parents and joined by hundreds of thousands of students and teachers who simply refused to take the tests. This activism helped roll back high school exit testing from 27 states in the early 2000s to 6 states today, unfortunately including my own state, New Jersey. We saw the decline of PARCC, which has disappeared, and SBAC, which has been greatly reduced. We saw a fiscal credibility crisis of test publishers that's been caused by scoring errors, business failures, and corruption stories. We've seen the growth of test-free optional college admissions. Today, more than 2/3 of all four-year colleges are test optional for admissions. And in 2018, we saw a Red for Ed wave of teacher strikes and protests that helped change the national focus of education reform debates from tests and charters to school funding and teachers' salaries, and helped limit or overturn some of the worst test-based teacher evaluation programs. But while we've won some important victories, the effort to end the misuse and overuse of standardized testing is far from over. A recent national survey of K-8 academic assessments found what it called a crowded and incoherent testing landscape. Here are the key findings of this study, which was done just this past February. Students take as many as 88 academic assessments before entering school, many requiring multiple administrations per year. In the highest testing districts, students were taking an average of 7 different assessments per grade, and each typically they had to take 1 to 3 times a year. English learners especially face higher testing volume than their peers, with an additional of an incredible 47 additional hours of testing across K-8. And at the bottom of this, the study said it found no relationship between assessment volume, and academic proficiency or growth. More testing was not leading to more learning. We've also seen attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and disability rights, which have also impacted testing policy. The most common assessment-related civil rights complaints involve denial of testing accommodations for students with disabilities, the use of assessments that segregate or track students based on race, and discriminatory use of tests for graduation or promotion. But the decimation of the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights means federal enforcement of these rights has virtually disappeared. Between March and September of 2025, the Office of Civil Rights resolved more than 7,000 of the 9,000 complaints it received by dismissing the complaints with virtually no satisfaction and no investigation. We've also seen the current science of reading impact movement has also had an increasing impact. We've seen 40 states have passed SOR laws or policies, and most of those involved additional screening tests. Many SOR laws require schools to adopt curriculum materials from approved lists or commercial vendors. And some SOR policies promote grade retention. You may have heard of the Mississippi Miracle, which raised fourth grade reading scores on the NAEP tests by holding back thousands of third graders with low reading scores and keeping them out of the testing pool. So the fight against high-stakes standardized testing is far from over. It's a reminder that to defeat test and punish policies, we not only need to end high-stakes standardized testing, we need to develop alternatives, and not just alternative assessments, as important as those are. We need alternative models of education that put children and education justice at the center. And that's why the work of the consortium, which is not only about alternative models of assessment, but also about alternative models of education, remains so important. What if we realized, said Imran Kendi, what if we realized the best way to ensure an effective educational system is not by standardizing our curricular and our tests, but by standardizing the opportunities available to all students. Good opportunities for all kids in schools that put learning, not testing, at the center. That's the goal.
Thank you so much, Stan. And now on to our panel discussion. I've listed our panelists in alphabetical order by first name. Panelists, please wave your hand when I read your bio so people can match you to your description. First, we have Athena Collin. Athena is a math teacher and instructional coach supporting teachers across the consortium. She's been a math teacher for 16 years in the DOE, with a majority of those years at consortium schools. She is the mom of a curious and energetic 2-year-old boy and loves yoga, delicious food, time with her family, and traveling to new places. Next is Gareth Robinson. Born in Trinidad and Tobago, Gareth was raised by his mother in Washington, D.C., where he attended the Sidwell Friends School on scholarship. He joined the first cohort of the New York City Teaching Fellows in 2000 and spent the next 12 years teaching English. In 2013, Gareth became the founding principal of the Institute for Health Professions at Cambria Heights, a small progressive career and technology high school partnered with Hofstra University, Northwell Health and Centers Healthcare. Gareth holds a doctorate in educational policy and leadership. His research includes race, social class, and school leadership. And representing the letter S, we have Susie Kang. Susie has been teaching neuroscience and human biology at Essex Street Academy for the last 15 years. She is the data specialist, programmer, and science department coordinator. Prior to Essex, she was a founding teacher at another consortium school in the South Bronx. She is an avid runner and baker and a mom to 2 girls, ages 8 and 10. And we are so grateful to all of you for taking the time to be with us here tonight. The panelists will begin by responding to questions I've prepared, and after that, they'll respond to the questions you've put in the chat. So again, if you have questions as we go along, please just type them in the chat. And I'd like to start by asking each of you panelists to share your reactions to Stan's presentation. What struck you most about his presentation and why? Gareth, would you go first, please?
Sure. So good evening, everybody. So I think the thing that resonated with me most is that standardized testing is very seductive because it really simplifies a very complicated thing, human development, learning, um, how you educate children. It's not a very simple thing, but standardized testing definitely makes it seem easy. It's an easy story to tell. Um, yeah.
What about you, Athena?
Yeah, for me, I think the point that landed the hardest for me was the idea that came up at the end that we really need not just alternative assessments, but also alternative models of education. When our assessments are standardized, that also leads to a different type of classroom experience, which it just does not center children and justice in the way that the data shows us we need to be doing better.
And Susie, what resonated most with you?
So I've been teaching in consortium schools for 21 years now, but it's only recently that my students, that my own children have started experiencing standardized teaching, standardized testing in their schools. So being ages 8 and 10, so my third grader is about to she's now going through curriculum that's really emphasizing standardized testing. And my fifth grader has, been through these tests for a few years now. And I'm seeing how it's impacting their relationship to learning in their schools. There's all this emphasis from the administrators, like there's Saturday academies, after school workshops to prepare students for testing, and the narrowing of curriculum that Stan talked about in his presentation. I'm just like, wow, like I'm seeing this happen to my children, and I'm realizing I haven't done enough to push back. That a slide about all the ways that parents have resisted. I'm like, what have I done as a parent? I've been talking about how to resist this as a teacher in a consortium school, but I haven't really practiced that in my personal life with my students. So that was personally challenging for me.
Thank you. Ever since my own children were in kindergarten, I've heard again and again that there is immense pressure on schools to raise test scores, and that pressure reaches all the way down into the classroom. And Susie, can you speak a little bit about how teaching and learning are affected when a school's focus is to get all students to perform on a standardized test?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for teachers whose job, depends on their students' testing performance, right? And you're told you have to get a certain number of students to pass this test. You can't deviate from the curriculum. You must teach to the test so that the students do well, because that affects the school's ratings. It affects your rating as a teacher, right? And so that leaves you with no room to deviate from the curriculum. You are told, you're prescribed what to teach, and you have to stick to that. There is no freedom to try anything new. And that's what I love about teaching in consortium schools, that I have the ability to do that. But I know other teachers that I've met at teacher workshops when we're learning things about, for example, personalizing education or having students pursue their own inquiry questions. And other teachers are like, I don't have time to do that. I have to get through these tests. I have to get through the material that's going to be tested in May or in June.
Yeah. All right. Same question for you, Athena. What happens to teaching and learning in an educational environment intently focused on test scores?
Yeah, so I've experienced teaching in both settings, and I can genuinely say that you can feel in these test-centered classrooms, you just feel the joy kind of being sucked out of the room. There's a focus on this breadth over depth, right? Like covering more material in less time versus going deep on a particular idea. And it just doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't give students the time that they need to really explore, to share their authentic voice, and to experience true inquiry. The pressures that exist really shift the entire experience for both the teacher and the students.
Thank you. Gareth, I have a question for you prepared, but I also wanted to just backtrack a second because I got a little back channel message that there's more that you wanted to answer in response to that first question about responding to Stan's presentation. So if you can fill us in on that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I think two other things that just kind of stood out is number one, in some of the research, it talks about that we've known what the consequences of a focus on standardized testing would be, that it's in the research. And then I think also one of the things that resonates with me is that as somebody who did not grow up in New York State and attended an independent school, we didn't take any standardized test that I can remember. And yet all of us went on to college, all of us did, fairly well for ourselves. And so it was a challenge for me becoming a teacher in 2000 and having not been from New York to see how important teaching to the exam was for me as a high school English teacher. That it was one of the first tips I was given was if my principal came in to observe me, make sure you mention the Regents exam and make sure you talk about a critical lens essay. And so that was just an interesting transition for me personally.
Okay, I'm going to continue with the question I had prepared for you, which is actually kind of similar to that, so you can just expand it. I mentioned earlier that in order to graduate, consortium students are required to take only one Regents exam in English language arts, whereas most public school students in New York State have to take 4, often 5 Regents. I often hear the concern that if students aren't in the habit of taking standardized tests, that they will be at a disadvantage because at some point they're going to have to take a consequential standardized test. And so as a school leader of a consortium school where students are not taking Regents exams in most subjects, what are your thoughts on this? If we don't prepare students for standardized tests now, how will they fare later when they might have to take tests for college admission or professional boards, et cetera?
All right. Well, so I think my school is an interesting case study in this because, in terms of the New York State requirements, yes, we are only required to do the English Regents exam. However, as a health science CT school that has an EMT program, a nursing aid program, and now also a pharmacy tech program, our kids have to take standardized tests in order to earn their certifications so that they can work as an EMT or a nursing assistant or a pharmacy tech to help, support themselves or support their way through school. But I think there's a difference between the New York State. I'll use the EMT basic original exam as the one that my kids take. Um, the kids know exactly what's going to be on the test. And it's very different from the surprising nature of what can happen on, say, an English Regents exam. Sometimes we as the adults read the passages and it's like, oh, this one might be good, or we recognize like our kids are going to be in trouble because they have very limited experience with the content matter or the style of writing. And so the standardized tests that my kids take are just not that way. They know what's going to be on it. It's just a matter of studying and studying well. And I think it's also, we mustn't forget that, okay, as a consortium school, we only give one of the standardized exams, but that's not the only test that my kids are ever going to take in school. Our teachers do a lot of assessment, and yes, we believe that if you have an assessment pyramid, that the performance-based assessment is at the top, is the most important of the assessments we give. We're still going to give quizzes. We're still going to do constructed response answers to different things. I think it's just the way in which we're going to do it in the non-standardized way is a lot more similar to how New York State develops its EMT exam. The kids are going to know what's on it. They're going to know what's expected of them so they can actually prepare for it.
Thank you. And I want to clarify, I mentioned college admissions tests in that last question, but before we get too far away from that, I think it's really important to make clear that the majority of colleges in this country including SUNY, New York State's public university system, and CUNY, New York City's public university system, do not require SAT or ACT scores. And there have been some news reports about schools reinstituting exam requirements post-pandemic, and I think Stan mentioned that too. But that really is the exception. Most schools remain test optional, and a few don't even let applicants submit scores at all. So how does that play out at your school, Gareth? Like, how do colleges respond to the fact that your students haven't taken Regents exams and instead have completed performance-based assessments? Is it an impediment at all in terms of colleges?
For us, no, it's never really come up from the college side of it. And so I think one of the good things with our students coming out of this consortium experience is for some schools, they can include their PBATs as samples of their writing as part of their college application. So, my students are able to, we've got our first few Ivy League kids a couple of years ago. We got our first Macaulay Honors students last year. We have kids who are getting almost full rides to nursing schools. We're getting kids into Hunter's nursing program. And so, the kids are very much ready for it. And I think that the colleges, at least in our experience, we submit a school profile that includes that we are not doing a lot of the state standardized exams and explain what a PBAT is. And so our kids are ready, and it hasn't been an issue getting any of our kids into college ever because of not taking the Regents.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that college admissions offices use something called the school profile. So they kind of know what is happening in that school in terms of whether they have standardized testing, where they have writing, whatever. So they're not just comparing everybody on the same level. They're looking at them within the context of their own school. So, okay, moving on to the issue of curriculum standardization and why and how consortium schools support teachers to develop their own curriculum. Over the last several years, New York City has begun to mandate specific commercially produced reading and math curricula for elementary and middle schools. Currently, high schools have one curriculum mandate for algebra. However, recent remarks by the chancellor leave open that more mandates may be coming for older students too. So let's begin this next round of questions with that algebra curriculum mandate, since it's already in place. Athena, the curriculum that the city is mandating for algebra is called illustrative math, often referred to as IM. I understand that you've been an algebra teacher for many years and have used IM as a resource in developing curriculum for your courses. Can you help us understand the difference between using a commercially purchased curriculum as a resource versus being mandated to use it with a district-provided pacing guide?
Yeah, so my experience with this is it's very interesting because IM in particular is a curriculum that I used as a resource for many years as a teacher at a consortium school. And what it means to use a curriculum as a resource means that you as the teacher have the freedom and flexibility to kind of sift through that curriculum and decide when and how you're going to use it. So I can go through and I can choose a lesson that I think will resonate for my students, and I can decide that I'm going to spend a day or 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is on this lesson. I also had the experience for a year with the mandate teaching at a non-consortium school where I was mandated to teach the IM curriculum. And what it means to be mandated to do so means that it often comes with a pacing guide. And so the pacing guide tells you not only what lesson you should be doing when, but how long you should be spending with that lesson. So what that means is when you couple that with a Regents exam at the end and all of the timing and the time constraints and the pressures, as a teacher now, you know that, okay, I did, unit 3, lesson 2 today. I was supposed to, according to the pacing guide, spend 1 day on this, but my students just don't get it. And now I have to decide, am I going to ignore my students and move on so that if my principal walks in or the district walks in, I don't get in trouble? Or am I going to sort of break the rules and respond to my students and their needs and, spend more time or supplement that lesson with additional experiences to help them truly meet the learning target for that lesson? And so there's a really big difference there when a curriculum is mandated versus just being used as a resource.
Thank you so much. One important critique of the curricula that have been mandated in New York City is that they are not culturally responsive. That is, these curricula are designed to appeal to a broad national audience. They aren't designed with the identities, interests, strengths, and needs of New York City students and the rich learning environment of the city itself. And so, Susie, I'd like to ask you how you have approached building culturally responsive curriculum for your students. And is this a solo endeavor, or do you work with other teachers in your school or at other schools to make sure your curriculum works well?
Yeah, it is absolutely a joint endeavor. We talk a lot at our school about collective action and collective responsibility and creating curriculum that is culturally responsive and something that will, center students' identities, their interests, what students value. And so what our school does is we ask every teacher to work on a curriculum map where teachers reflect on how their curriculum is elevating students' identities. We incorporate various frameworks. So, for example, we use NYU's culturally relevant curriculum STEAM scorecard, and we take time out of our department meetings to look at each other's curricula and score it. We draw on Goldie Mohammed's Cultivating Genius framework and think about how does our curriculum incorporate criticality and identity and joy. We review each other's maps and give feedback. And that has led to us creating some really amazing, awesome projects that we really feel like speak to students' lived experiences, allow students to bring in those experiences. So, for example, one of our teachers at my school taught a food science class, and they were learning about fermentation and glycolysis. But as a final project, one student did an experiment on a queso fresco recipe that her parents had brought over from Mexico, and about different ways to better encourage the process of creating a better queso fresco, right? We've done local environmental pollution studies where students are actually measuring air quality in different areas of where they're living, where there are schools located. I teach a neuroscience class and a human biology class, and the final PBAT topic, the performance-based assessment task topic, is really driven by this question of what is the biggest mental or physical health challenge that teenagers face today? And as part of undertaking coming up with the question that they're going to ask for their experiment, they conduct empathy interviews and talk to parents and community members about what do you see as the big problems that teenagers are facing, and based on that, they create a final project that counts as their graduation exhibition project.
I have to say that sounds amazing. And actually the teachers in the first couple of sessions of this series talked about how writing curriculum was intellectually stimulating for them and a creative part of their work that made them better teachers for their students. And so I think your answer also really speaks to that creativity and intentionality and professionalism that teachers can bring to writing their own curriculum, which is lost if you're buying it. Athena, as I mentioned earlier, the inquiry teaching approach in consortium schools organizes learning around students' ideas and questions, and around students' ideas and questions, and by honoring their thinking, builds their identities as thinkers and doers in the discipline. It's an approach that builds learning from who the students in the room are. You are supporting teachers across consortium schools to implement an inquiry-based alternative to the illustrative math curriculum. How do you support teachers to understand their students and build inquiry-based lessons that meet their needs?
Gareth, any chance you can start us off on that while Athena works out her computer issues, how you work with the teachers at your school?
Sure. I think one of the first things I'll always ask my teachers when they're planning curriculum is when you think about your own children or the children who are most important to you and your family, is this the type of education you want them to have? Is this the type of work you want them to do? Is this the type of thinking you want them to engage in? And so I think that helps us just establish, on a personal level, a high bar. Because no one's ever going to say, oh, I want my children to do rote, boring things. They're going to want a rich curriculum for their kids. The other thing that my school does is even before the state started working on this whole portrait of a graduate, that was part of how the school was designed. We thought about what does a freshman in college who would like to work in healthcare, what types of skills will they have? What types of academic skills will they have? What types of social emotional skills will they have? And starting with that own, our school's portrait of a graduate, now to backwards plan year by year the types of learning experiences we want the kids to experience so that they will develop those particular skills on their way. They come to us as, eighth graders, still kids, and they leave us as young adults. And we want them to have that transition into young adulthood with the tools and skills that they need to be successful. Even though some of our kids can graduate and go right to work, we always try to make sure that college is a genuine option for all of our students. We want to make sure that if they choose, will be able to go to college, will be able to do well, will understand the things that will be expected of them, even though we also do just generalized post-secondary planning. Kids will talk to about the military if they're interested. We have kids who want to go to trade school and become electricians or plumbers instead of going to college. And so we want to make sure that even if that's their plan, that if they so decide later to want to go to college, that they're prepared for it. And then ultimately, all of this work together really professionalizes the teachers in the consortium. They have to understand teaching and learning at a different level than folks who don't work in consortium schools.
Okay, so Athena is back from her temporary computer problem. And so I'm not going to ask my question with all of the build up to it, but I'll just say we were saying that you're working with consortium schools on an inquiry-based alternative to illustrative math. And how do you support teachers to understand their students and build inquiry-based lessons that meet their needs?
Yeah, so sorry about that. I think the key to the work is really about helping teachers design lessons where they incorporate moments that give students space to think, take academic risks, and know when, as the teacher, to step in versus step back. Oftentimes, what happens, especially when using or when in like a test-centered classroom, or if you're kind of trained to teach in that way, we don't trust our students. We don't step back enough to give them the space to show what they're capable of, and we don't show them that we value their approach to thinking about a problem or a task. And so oftentimes when I work with teachers and I encourage them to give students space, they are just so surprised by what students produce, or what they're thinking, or what they come up with. And I hear teachers all the time say, like, I was shocked. I didn't expect my students to say that or to know how to do that. You know, and even now, after 17 years working with students, I still see students solving problems that I've seen year after year after year. I see them solve it or approach it in a way that I've never thought of, or that I've never seen another student use before. And so I guess I'll just say briefly before we move on, I think oftentimes when people hear that I teach high school math, especially algebra, they're instantly like, they respond with something like, oh, I hate math. I'm not a math person. These sorts of things. And I think, it's because those of us who have learned math in a very traditional way, especially in New York State where you took the Regents exams, we were taught that math is very procedural and it's supposed to be done a certain, prescribed way. But in actuality, there's so many different ways to approach a single problem. And if students see and if teachers design lessons that allow them to see that the way that they see a problem is valid and can allow them to arrive at a correct answer, this just completely shifts the way that we understand mathematics and just brings a lot more student voice and student-centered experiences to learning in our classrooms.
Thank you so much for that. And now is when our panelist and our presenter, Stan, will answer your questions from the chat. You can still type into it if you'd like, or at this point you could raise your hand too, I think, if you prefer. I'm going to start off while the other questions might come through with like a question that we had for Stan, since I didn't get to ask him questions in the panel. Stan, we haven't spoken about it much this evening, but there's a commercial aspect to this whole topic. When it comes to both standardized testing and standardized curriculum, schools and districts are entering into contracts with companies to purchase their testing or curriculum products. Can you speak a little bit about the testing and curriculum industries, or maybe it's industry single, not plural? And if it's a single entity bridging both curriculum and testing, what are the implications of that?
A good question. I think they're definitely overlapping markets, but I think one of the important things to remember about both the testing and curriculum companies is that they are to education pretty much what pharmaceutical companies are to healthcare. These are corporate entities that are much more interested in market share and profits than in learning, and it's also even though many of them operate as nonprofits, which means they're subsidized by public dollars, and yet the ultimate consumers of these products, students and teachers, have almost no say and no leverage that consumers sometimes have, especially in an example of you're talking about restricted choice. Instead of going to choosing another product, they're, often don't have the consumers of these products often don't have any choices. That's supposedly one of the advantages of the market. The largest testing companies are Pearson, ETS, ACT, and Cambrian. And I think all of them operate as nonprofits, even though this is a $15 billion industry that's growing around the world, and especially since the, increase in technology required to take these tests. This has also improved and increased the leverage that these companies have over the market and over what the products available at the end point are. My Rethinking Schools colleague, Wayne Au, has written a terrific book about this called Unequal by Design, which I think is a good resource for people interested in looking into the business of producing curriculum and testing on standardized basis.
Thank you for that, Stan. Okay, so we're going to go to a couple of questions that have come through. Here's one. This information about the damage to children, schools, and education as a whole has been known for so long. My question is, why is it so hard to get stakeholders and decision makers to metabolize the reality that has been clear for decades? Excellent question. Anybody like to take a stab at that?
I'll take a stab. I think it goes back to my answer that the test scores, it makes the whole process simple. If I'm an elected official and I'd like to push through some education reform, It's a lot easier to say X number of students aren't proficient, whatever scary numbers often put in. But in terms of if you wanted to put all the consortium schools together, it's a more complicated story we have to tell. It's a better story, but it can't be told in a handful of bullet points. So I think that's one of the things why it sticks around. Even though we know the damage, it's the people who are writing the legislation don't want to hear or don't have time to listen to the complicated story we can tell about teaching and learning. It's just a lot easier to keep pushing through the simple thing. And the test scores, if they're low, allow me to put through any kind of reforms that I want.
Not to mention that what determines whether a test score is low or high is variable because the cut scores change, right? So, uh, can anybody else on the panel? We're good on time, so if anybody else would like to chime in about that question before we go to the next one.
Well, I just add that the inequality that exists, in our schools and is reflected in the test scores exists, throughout the society. And the commitments to having diversity, democratic choices, having eliminating the hierarchies and divisions that exist in society um, are not strong enough to overcome the impulses right now of standardization and the fact that the standardization and the current, unequal structures in education and in markets and in our society benefit certain groups of society who have the power to maintain those institutions. And I think, getting rid of standardized testing, our best example has been these mass movements against standardized testing. And I think we're going to need that kind of democratic activism throughout all areas of society in order to have a more democratic society, not just around standardized testing, but in society as a whole.
Okay, we have another question here. I'm wrestling with how to get others to understand that a scripted curricula is not going to be responsive and truly exploratory in the way a framework that allows for teacher creativity can be, even if it claims to be. And a lot of them do claim to be, for example, expeditionary learning curriculum in ELA. Gareth, you are an English teacher, so I don't know, not to push this on you, but since the other folks are not.
Maybe just like a simple analogy, when it's like reading one of those old choose your own adventure books versus reading the novel. Okay, Great Gatsby is my favorite novel. Um, but the story has an order. There's a way that the story operates. I could want to go imagine something else, but it's not going to be there. Whereas in a choose your own adventure book, if you want to choose one route and then go back and then try a different one, you have the flexibility to do that. And I think that that might be a similar experience with canned curriculum for teachers with the pacing guide. Like, legitimately, what happens if you want to go back to a previous day because you realize your kid struggled? If you have a pacing guide that the district is enforcing, you can't. You have to keep following that one story. And that one story has to work somehow for all of the kids in your room. And sometimes it might be you go back one day, you work more, you spend a little extra time on something, and then that feeds the kids forward. And maybe then you can pick up the pace a little bit. Or maybe you have to do this back and forth over and over again. And our consortium teachers have the ability to stop, start, slow down, pick up the speed, to adjust it. So then that way the kids are really getting to authentically choose their own adventure as opposed to just listening to the same story over and over again.
I talked in the chat about this a little bit, but I find that scripted science curriculum goes exactly against the nature of what science should be. at our school and at a lot of consortium schools, we think about how can we train students to do what like adult writers, mathematicians, scientists, historians do, right? And so for me, when I think about science, inquiry is at the very nature of what a scientist does. Observe the world around you, get curious, ask questions, pursue those questions, find answers to those questions, right? And if I think about the biology regents exam, it's like, here are the 4 labs that you're going to do. Everybody's going to do them exactly the same way. We all know what's going to happen. We all know what the answer is going to be, but we have to go through all these motions because that's what's required on the regents for you to sit down and take this regents exam. It completely strips the curriculum of inquiry and personalization and the ability for students to be able to ask questions and get curious.
Okay. All right. So we are gonna I'm gonna say I'm just so grateful for Gareth and Stan and Susie and Athena for being here on the panel and answering your questions. Thank you so much and giving us your insights. We're gonna move on to the next part of this meeting, and I'm going to invoke in my very first question tonight. Susie said that when Stan referred to the gains made through parent activism, she felt challenged to wonder about whether she, as a parent of young children, was doing enough to push back against the growing tide of standardization in schools. So I'm going to devote the next few minutes to talking about ideas for what you can do to push back, and then we'll have a brief Q&A. So please continue to put questions in the chat. And I'm going to start with a general principle, one that is at the heart of the work of the consortium, and really anybody who organizes, always try to bring others along. Your lone voice may be righteous, but it is easily drowned out. And now let's get more specific and talk about how you push back against standardized testing. If you are the parent of a child in 3rd through 8th grade, state ELA testing begins immediately after break. While schools are required by law to administer the test, it is a parent's right to refuse the test on behalf of their children. This has been confirmed by both the feds and the state, as you can see in this memo on the screen. Personally, I strongly believe that every parent should opt their child out of the state test. It doesn't matter if your child is a good test taker or a nervous one. Refusing the test is not about your individual child. It is about striking a blow to a system that weaponizes data gleaned from the test to rank and sort students in schools. And the schools that land on the bottom are never the ones that serve the most well-off kids and communities. It is about striking a blow to a way of doing school that limits what experiences teachers and administrators can offer to your child, like the teachers we're just talking about now, because test prep is a more efficient route to higher scores than nurturing your children's curiosity or cultivating their creativity. And this is an equity issue. Middle-class children, children whose parents have college degrees, children who come from English-speaking homes, these children often attend schools less dominated by test prep because it is assumed that they are getting a degree of preparation at home or in extracurriculars. So let's talk about opting out. To opt out, all you need to do is to send an email, text, or written note to the principal and CC your child's teachers saying that you are refusing the test for your child. If you write a note, take a picture, so you'll have a digital trail. The NYC opt-out website and Facebook page are good resources for sample opt-out letters and more. The link for them is in the chat. And after sending in an opt-out letter, some parents have been informed by their school that they have to meet with their principal. You do not have to meet with the principal to refuse the test. It is your right to do so. Politely decline, otherwise the meeting will be used to try to talk you out of your decision. Here are a few important things to know about opting out of these tests. Refusing the test means your child is assigned no score, not a low score, as some people mistakenly think. The spot on the transcript where scores would appear will be blank. There are no adverse consequences for students for not taking the tests. Even screened middle and high schools do not consider state test scores in their admissions formulas, which didn't used to be the case, but is the case now. Just keeping your child home on testing days is not enough. Without an opt-out letter, the school will just try to test them on a make-up day. If a lot of students at your school opt out, the students not testing might remain in their classes doing normal activities. If that's not the case in your school, be sure to include in your opt-out letter that you want an alternate activity for your kid on test days. In addition to a relatively benign testing day experience at schools with high rates of test refusal, another huge advantage of organizing other folks in your school to opt out with you is that you may be able to get the school to stop or at least greatly reduce test prep. My older child would get huge test prep packets over spring break. She really resented them. And by the time her younger sister was in a testing grade, parents had started organizing a mass opt-out at the school and no more test prep packets. So people often also ask about Regents exams, like, can you opt out of those? At present, you cannot opt out of Regents exams and graduate with a Regents diploma. The exception is if your child attends a consortium school because we have a waiver, but ELA is not waived, or a private school, the original opt-out. But stay tuned because in the near future, Regents exams will no longer be required for graduation in New York State. There is, however, one other category of standardized tests broadly administered to children in New York City. These are city tests referred to as screeners. Screeners are given 3 times a year to all children from kindergarten through 10th grade. Brand names include Acadience for younger children and iReady or MAP for older children. The city justified its multi-million-dollar contracts for the screeners by saying that they would identify students in need of extra support. But in a survey of 109 teachers, 98% stated that the screeners were no better at identifying students who needed support than were the methods the teachers were already using. The survey uncovered other problems with the screeners, including that they were inappropriate for English language learners and that they interfered with students receiving mandated services. The DOE has been touting the reading screeners as key to identifying students with dyslexia so that they can receive additional support. But recent reporting by the New York Times has indicated that little has changed in terms of that support actually being provided. So, can you opt out of the screeners like you opt out of the state tests? What seems to have worked for some parents is to be very direct and firm. Send a note saying, I do not consent to my child being assessed by fill in the blank with the appropriate screener, iReady, MAP, Acadience. And you can include in the note also, if you need to screen my child, please have the teacher do this directly. Again, the NYC opt-out website has resources, including a sample letter. And so now mandated curriculum, how do we push back against that? Because the curriculum mandates are fairly new, the organized resistance to them in New York City is also fairly new. So if things are to change on this front, parents will have to join with educators to demand change. So here are the steps. 1, educate yourself about what curricula are being used in your child's school. Ask, say, your child's ELA teacher how ELA was taught before the mandate. Did children read whole books or just excerpts like they're reading with the mandated curriculum? 2, find allies. A good place to start learning and join with others is the website of Families and Educators for Responsive Instruction, FAIRY for short. FAIRY also has a mailing list you can join, and that link is in the chat. And once you have information and allies, which hopefully you find through organizations like FAIRY, or teachers might also find them through your unions, go to meetings of your Community Educational Council, also known as the CEC, and or the Panel for Education Policy, which is New York City School Board. These bodies meet monthly and have time allocated for community comments. In one successful campaign, parents from one Brooklyn school showed up meeting after meeting with their children. The children testified about how much they hated the new curriculum, how they were robbed of the chance to read whole books, etc. And because of their relentlessness and their persistence, that school was able to get a waiver from the HMH reading curriculum. So that was a very compressed little primer there that could have been a whole meeting in itself. But if you have questions for me, raise your hand or write them in the chat, and we'll use the next few minutes to answer you. And I'm seeing one that was already in that we also took questions off the registration form. Here was one from the registration form. Why is it not mandated that public schools have to tell parents they can opt out, refuse/deny, rather than trying to trick them? That is such an excellent question. I think I'm going to answer this myself. I have been involved in this work for many, many years. And back in 2015, I witnessed something that I sort of couldn't believe, which is that there was a unanimous resolution in the city council. That is, every single city council person voted that the DOE should inform parents of their right to opt out. That was more than 10 years ago. It has never happened. And so I believe this is because of how school governance is in New York City, that the mayor and the mayor alone controls the schools. So what city council thinks is just advisory. It doesn't hold weight. Okay, here's another question. Has anyone connected with Chancellor Samuels or Mamdani re the scripted curricula? This is such a recent change and such a negative one. Samuels for sure knows this, having been a soup in Brooklyn. Does anybody want to take that? AJ, do you think you could respond to this?
Yes, but I have no idea what my background looks like, so I'm just going to keep my camera off. I think that folks are, like you said, this is such a recent change that folks are still trying to organize themselves to figure out how best be heard. As Kamala said, the way that school governance happens in New York City right now, it's hard to know exactly how to make the school system responsive to the community as opposed to responsive to from the top down. And so I think one of our challenges as a group of educators and a group of parents is how to start to demand that the school system respond to the communities that it serves rather than to whoever the mayor is at the time. And I do think that there is some opening, right, about the policies that Mayor Mamdani ran on to make the school system more democratic, to make it more responsive to communities. And so the question is, I think, for people who are interested in organizing around this issue, how to make sure that that message comes out, how to make sure that our demand to have a school system that responds to the needs of our students is heard. And also our support for the sort of larger vision of a responsive school system that is coming from the mayor's office in rhetoric becomes a reality.
Yeah, and one thing strikes me is that there is now that's supposed to be an office for organizing. So maybe we have to figure out how to get in there. And give you a second, AJ, if you see anything else in the chat or if anybody has any other questions. Okay. From Rachel, who is a wonderful teacher. I have a plea. Can everyone here bring up in every conversation about quote unquote data that quantitative data is only one kind and qualitative data is very robust too? Point taken. I don't know if anybody would like to address that directly. Maybe you, Stan, or anybody really.
Well, I think it's a very good point. I think, I think I talked a little bit about Campbell's Law, and I think Gareth mentioned earlier that the idea of reducing education to a learning to a quantitative measure is both totally inadequate and is going to have a bad effect on the process it's supposedly monitoring, um, which is going to be much more complicated than any quantitative measure is going to be able to capture. And I think Susie and the other panelists, mentioned this and what its effect was in the classroom. And so I definitely think that the more we can get away from standardized testing, the better we have a chance to do the kind of education kids need and teachers want to provide.
Good point. I would just add to that another thing that people may not be aware of is that these new standardized curriculum actually have testing embedded in them, that they're like end of unit tests. So that's on top of all the other tests that the students are taking. They have those tests built into those curricula on screens. So it's more screen time in the classroom, which I know is at this point not what a lot of parents want for their children. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to wrap us up here and say thank you for being here. The remaining session in this series will be Monday, April 20th. It's called What Happens to Consortium Students After They Graduate? And we will hear from a researcher, Michelle Fine, and consortium graduates on exactly that topic. The sign-up link is in the chat if you haven't already registered or want to tell others about this series. And we have one last slide. Where to find us. You can find us online in these spaces. If you want to explore the consortium further, we also invite you to join our mailing list. The sign-up link will be in the chat. And good night, and thank you for coming.